Okay, it's 10 after, so I'm going to start. First, happy Halloween, and I hope it won't be quiet. Yeah, happy Halloween. Second, any of you who have families on the East Coast, I hope everything is all right there, or at least as all right as it can be. And so, Halloween, enjoy. Hope it's not too rainy. The storm, which I take quite seriously, and the election is November 6th. So if you have an absentee ballot, you need to send it in. If you are going to vote locally, you need to remember to do that. It's just incredibly important. And I would say if you have family members who vote, make sure they do it. And if you have ideas, you might share those with them or listen to them. And if you need, so one of the points I'm going to make later when we get to political institutions is that things like the initiative and referendum process in California. So how many of you actually have looked at a ballot yet? Okay, so I did mine last night and mailed it this morning. I usually vote absentee just because it's easier. And it took 2 people with PhDs 2 hours to fill the thing out. And we still weren't sure we made the right choices on every single proposition. There is a quite good voter guide at kqed.org that gives you the pros and cons. There's a pamphlet that comes with your ballot that allows you to read. Sometimes we just go by who's supporting or opposing something. There are this myriad of offices. And so the kind of political institutions you have include things like whether you have that kind of ballot that most people have very little way of knowing how to vote on. They don't know what's in their interest. They can't tell from the language of the title of the proposition whether it's in their interest or not. So California elections, because of the way they are organized, tend to be dominated by the votes of wealthier, whiter, better educated, and older people far disproportionately, whereas some of the older systems still left over from the political machine days in the big cities of the East Coast still allow, for example, party line voting. It used to be in the old days, if you really had party line voting, you could pull one lever and you just automatically voted for all the Democratic or all the Republican candidates. It made it really easy to know who was who. The elections were partisan. You knew which party was your party and you voted your party. And we have, quote, good government reforms, and I'll talk more about these, but just while you're actually voting, think about what the class and political implications are of having a ballot like California's ballot that has this huge number of propositions. You don't really know who sponsored them. You don't really know who wrote them. You don't know whether they're good or bad. And you don't know whether the legislature is then responsible for the actual policies California has, or whether they have some constraint built into, you know, some proposition long ago. So, I mean, I support many of the ballot propositions, and, you know, this is the way California politics comes. You have to deal with the world you've got, not the world you might wish you had. But I just want you to think about, this is a very good example of how political institutions structure the ways you can choose, the kinds of choices available to you. And so you should take your ballot seriously. You should probably consult somebody whom you trust about how to vote on the things you're not sure about so you don't make some dumb mistake. But even filling out the ballot makes you feel so insecure that it actually discourages voting. So I would say, you know, of course, you can always skip some local office and just not vote for that at all. But it's a very particular kind of political institutions. California has actually quite distinctive political institutions that are very much unlike those of most other states. Actually, I couldn't save my ballot because you actually have to send it in. But maybe I'll scan a copy of the voter guide, and when I lecture, for those of you who aren't from California, I took a copy of a California ballot. I was in France for a year teaching a course on American political culture. So I got my absentee ballot while I was in France, filled it out there, and I took it into my French seminar and showed them what the ballot, they were just dumbfounded. They could not believe that that was what it meant to vote in the US. They were just beside themselves. I mean, it was, so while you are doing this, while you are voting, which is incredibly important and you need to do it, you can learn something sociological. Okay, now, so I think I've covered the important issues. Do not forget to vote. I cannot tell you how important it is. Okay, last time we talked about a very big picture way of thinking about the structural constraints on social mobility, and I talked about the role of education in particular and cultural capital more generally in, if you think about it from the point of view of the privileged, a way of transmitting privilege. And in a way that Weber in Class, Status, and Party would have understood very well, it's a mixed bag. So in some ways, cultural capital, I pointed out, has advantages over economic capital. Again, if you leave your wealth to your children, you have to give it up before they can have it. If you leave your excellent vocabulary and grammar to your children, you can keep using it while they're using it. You don't have to divide it up among your children. And in some ways, it is a more robust way of transmitting advantage than other modes of transmitting advantages. On the other hand, and this is very much in line with Weber's arguments about status claims, if you claim that the reason you are in the elite is because you are smarter and make better contributions to society and are more devoted to the common good and you volunteer for more organizations and so forth than other people do, and then new groups start achieving those things, so they have high test scores and they show commitment to volunteer service and they have many talents and write poetry and play musical instruments and write their own novels by the time they're 12 or something, then those kids get admitted to universities. So education is both a mode of transmitting advantage that legitimates, the way status group claims do, the advantages of those who end up with advantages. And let me try to just give you an intuitive grasp of what I'm trying to get at here. There's very good work, for example, showing that kids who go to junior college, as many of you probably did, have the experience that they sit in class with a lot of other people. Now, those of you who are here in this room sat in class with a lot of other people and you did better than they did. And so you got to transfer to a top-notch four-year institution. But many other people who sat in your class made those B's and C's that you didn't make. And they learned that they weren't as whatever, smart, capable, talented, dedicated as you were. And so most students who go to junior college do not. Even if they aspired to go to a four-year school when they entered junior college, they end up not going. But they end up experiencing the fact that they didn't go as being something about them. Because they know they sat right next to you, and you made the A, and they didn't. And if you sit in a class that has a curve, we actually don't, but if you sit in a class that has a curve, you'll have the same experience. You want to go to medical school and be a doctor, and you sit next to this other person in biochemistry or whatever. I don't mean to raise your blood pressure and your cortisol levels right here in the room, but you know, that person might get a 92 on the exam and you get an 85 or even a 70 on a serious, I'm looking at the periodic table in chemistry, but you know, on a serious chemistry or physics or biology exam. And again, you have the experience, okay, I wanted to go to medical school, but I'm just not good enough. So the fact is, junior colleges can't send everyone to a four-year school, right? They have to give some substantial proportion of the students in that classroom those B's, C's, D's, and F's, as does the biochemistry class with the curve. But it creates the experience for people that it wasn't that somebody else blocked you from opportunity. You didn't study hard enough, you weren't committed enough, you weren't smart enough, whatever. Something is lacking in you. So education does have this remarkable way of sorting people in a fair way. And in some respects, it really is fair. We hope it's fair. We try to make it fair. And in other respects, and this is what the people who analyze cultural capital are talking about, it's supremely unfair, both because it blinds you or covers up the structural things that block opportunity and makes you experience it as your problem, your fault, your weakness, rather than something about the structure out there, but also because some of the things that make people good in school have much more to do with their families, like, again, those students who come in with great writing skills and great reading skills and great vocabulary because they come from families with excellent grammar and excellent vocabulary, and because they go to schools that teach those writing skills early on and so forth. So I want you to think about education in this complex way, which is recognizing that it both is genuinely, objectively, a source of opportunity. And again, I'm going to go back to the little bit of the Blau and Duncan finding today. Oh God, no, they're saying no, anything but that. But the key point to remember from all that is that education was the major pathway through which parents could transmit advantages. And again, it is very hard to give your children advantages if you can't get them a BA. And if you get a BA, much of the influence of family background drops away. So for those who manage to get to that point, all right, now, with that as background, and there's some discussion of what I'm talking about today in the section you're reading from Inequality by Design. I'm going to talk about schools and schooling because Americans have this amazing faith, and in some ways it's justified, that if what you want to do is increase opportunity for those who, to use the phrase that the politicians all use, work hard and play by the rules, the way to do it is by making schools better, or by expanding schooling, or something. So I want to think about the degree to which that is true. Do schools increase opportunity? And if so, why? And if they don't, why not? Okay, so I want to start with an argument made probably 30 years ago by Christopher Jenks in a book called Inequality. And it was a brilliant intervention in discussions of stratification. And again, sociologists since the Blau and Duncan days had been beavering away, working like demons, studying everything that influenced individuals' success and failure. So how much did your IQ contribute? So it's not just that people have family advantages, that, you know, we don't really know what IQ is. We don't really know whether it's genetic, biological, something that happens to people in the womb related to their emotions, artificial construct. We don't know anything about it, but it predicts grades. That's how they construct the measure. So, I mean, it is what it is. But is it IQ? Is it willpower? Is it hard work? Is it personality? Is it looks? Is it the quality of the school you went to? Is it your guidance counselor? And particularly in Wisconsin. So University of Wisconsin was the center of this, although it was the national, the community of sociologists who studied stratification. It was just a huge effort to understand the determinants of individual success in life, the schools you went to and so forth. And Jenks ended up, and here I'm going to skip to the thing you least want to see in the world, the path diagram from Blau and Duncan. he ended up focusing on something some of you asked me about when I passed out that diagram, which is those little arrows that come from the sky. So remember this was father's education, father's occupation, and those were in turn related to respondents' education, so almost everything influenced that, which influenced respondents' first job, and the education plus the first job strongly influenced how prestigious and, I will say, how lucrative the occupation of the respondent was in 1962. Okay, and then all of those variables have these weird little arrows that come from outer space with very big numbers attached to them. So you've got these middle-sized numbers on the arrows, you know, 0.279, 0.394, and then from outer space comes 0.753. Okay, now I want you to just memorize a little factoid. I don't even know if it's a fact. It's by definition, essentially. These things they're not exactly correlation coefficients, they're regression coefficients, but the correlation coefficient squared equals the percentage of the variance explained. Okay? I just want you to memorize that sentence. The correlation coefficient squared equals the percentage of the variance explained. And it's in that sense that a high correlation coefficient, like 0.7, is a lot bigger. The difference between 0.6 and 0.7 is a lot bigger than the difference between 0.2 and 0.3, right? You square 2, you get 4. You square 3, you get 9. The difference between those is 7. You square 0.7, you get 49. You square 0.8, you get 64. The difference between those is much larger, right? Okay, so he focused on the unexplained variance. What those arrows coming from outer space are is everything else that's not in this model that accounts for where individuals rank in that occupational hierarchy in 1962. So this is basically the correlation with everything else, right? So one thing you can see is that this model, the variables measured here, and there are lots that's not measured, right? There's no measure of grades, there's no measure of school quality, there's no measure of IQ, there's no measure of personality. The variables included are very small, which is father's occupation, father's education. We don't know anything about these people's mothers, for example. That's not in the model. But with the things in the model, you can see that 0.75 times 0.75, I'm not going to work it out, but about 50% of the variation in occupation is unexplained by this model. Well, what Jake's pointed to, and this is really an important, fascinating point that has interested sociologists more recently, is that while parents' occupation and income and education does have an influence on outcomes, there's a huge amount of inequality that just isn't explained. And all those sociologists who worked like mad, adding variables to that basic model and measuring things better and including mothers as well as fathers and including high school quality, and again, whether you have a guidance counselor and whether your friends are going to college, and personality measures, and particularly there was something called the Wisconsin High School Study that went on for years and years and years. And in that relatively racially and ethnically homogeneous population, which was Wisconsin high school students in the 1960s and 70s, and this went on into the 80s, for all I know it's still going on, even with everything they could measure, and I mean they measured height, looks, motivation, personality, again, school quality, guidance counselors, everything sociologists could measure, they could only explain about crudely speaking, about half of the variation in life outcomes. And about half is just not explained either by features of you that you would maybe want a world in which smarter people, harder working people, more motivated people, people with more outgoing personalities did better. Or I don't know if outgoing, I think that should be important, but people who were hardworking and quiet might think that's a better, and probably is, a better trait, or at least hardworking and focused on the task at hand as opposed to distracted. But nonetheless, whatever it is you think makes people good, you might think those things should matter, and we shouldn't have everybody just have, if there were no relationship, in other words, between your traits and your life outcomes, it would seem like kind of an arbitrary, unfair world. Well, it turns out there is a relationship, but it's just not all that strong. About half the difference between people is, Jenks actually called it luck, but that's probably not quite the right description, but it's stuff that's kind of random. And one kind of thing, for example, and I've talked about this a little bit, is whether you happen to graduate in a year when there are lots of jobs, or you happen to graduate in a year when there are relatively few jobs. And we now know that people who happen to graduate in a year when there are relatively few jobs do worse, somewhat worse, and on average, this isn't everybody, do somewhat worse over their whole lives. And people who get that first job during a year when there are good first jobs end up advantaged over their whole lives. Well, that's kind of accident. It's like if you graduated in 2007, you might have done great. And if you graduated in 2008 or 9 or 10, you might have had a much harder time, been a couple of years behind. Even if you got a good first job eventually, it might have taken you a year or two to get that start. So you'd be a couple of years behind in income. Or maybe you would end up taking a worse job with worse career prospects. Or you might choose a profession that suddenly and unexpectedly 10 years later collapses. So you go off to be an attorney and you aren't that great, so you don't go to a really top law school, and you don't end up on law review, and you don't end up in a huge New York firm, or even maybe you do, and that particular firm collapses. It's been known to happen, actually. My father was an attorney, and law firms are an amazing thing. And they grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and get more and more associates, and then they fall apart. And then new ones start up, and then they grow and grow and grow. And it has to do with the way the top attorneys exploit the associates beneath them, and they can't grow enough to absorb all the people who need to be made partners. So when that crisis develops, it's very common, doesn't always happen, but it's very common for them to completely collapse. So if it doesn't collapse when you're just about to make partner, you're golden. And if it does collapse, well, And there are many, many other vicissitudes that we just don't understand. So well-known sociologist Dalton Conley has a book called Brothers. And it's about how different the life chances of brothers, meaning people who grew up in the same family with the same advantages, presumably drawing from the same basic these are genetically related brothers, how differently they do. He starts with the example of Bill Clinton and his brother, whom those of you who are young have never heard of, Roger Clinton. And Roger Clinton was I don't know enough about him, I'm not going to demean the person without really remembering what this story is, but I'll just say he was not successful like his brother. So Bill Clinton had a kind of, unsuccessful brother. Well, why? Why is one really successful? So what Jenks was trying to get across is that our view that if we just tinkered with the social machinery enough, we could really make life fair, so that we don't need to worry about how unequal the outcomes in society are. Some people can become mega millionaires and other people are going to be down in the dirt. But as long as we have opportunity, and opportunity is fair, it's fine. And he was trying to say, maybe not. maybe there's no imaginable system in which you could actually make everything fair, given that with everything we know, and again, I'll go back to this even though this just includes a little bit of everything we know, but there is just a huge amount of unexplained variation. And there's even more in the determination of income, because I'm going to point to a little shameful secret in the nature of studying stratification, which is the Occupational Prestige Index builds education into it, so that the prestigious occupations are those that require. So to some degree, it's fair to say that if you have a BA, you're more likely to end up as a manager in a big corporation and less likely to end up as a sales clerk in that same corporation, right? But you cannot be a lawyer or a doctor. I was going to say a Supreme Court justice, which is the most prestigious occupation, but actually that one, anybody can be appointed as Supreme Court justice. You don't have to, you don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to have, I mean, whoever, you can be, I don't think Earl Warren was ever a lawyer, so I'm not sure. Maybe these days you really couldn't, but that actually doesn't require a degree. But to be a professor, these build in, so the correlation between education and occupational prestige is actually built into the way the index is constructed, or at least it's built into the way people perceive the prestige of occupations. Income's even harder to predict. So again, you've got a situation in which we just don't know a lot of things about what make people unequal. Okay, so rather than focusing on the correlation and saying, wow, parents do have a lot of influence on their kids' outcomes, and that's true. And we saw that, by the way, let me remind you that the overall correlation between fathers and sons' occupations, and again, we're talking occupational prestige, not income, is 0.4. But if you remember that big outflow diagram, which I will not make you look at again, the one with millions of numbers, there's a lot more drag of parents on their kids at the top and the bottom ends. That is, advantaged parents really do advantage their kids more, and poor parents really do disadvantage kids more, and then there's a lot of modest mobility in the middle. But that overall 0.4 means only 16% of the variation in adult sons' occupational achievement is due to their, or is explained by, in the way sociologists talk about this, their father's occupational attainment. And that's just not all that much. And again, you can't get that percentage of the variance explained up past 50% with anything we know. Okay? So then Jenks asked the question of how much school quality matters. And this is a fascinating, fascinating, fascinating problem, and it's directly related to political debates, which are so not informed by social science research. It's amazing, amazing. And the finding is that, as I've been saying all along, education matters a lot. That is, how many years of schooling you get, whether you get a college diploma is hugely important. Whether you graduate from high school or not is hugely important. And there is some advantage to every additional year of education you get, whether you get 11 years versus 10 years of schooling, whether you get, again, the big degree years are more important, whether you get some post-college education, whether you get, I don't know whether getting a PhD always advantages you, because the lucrative things you can do in the world seem to me to require engineering degrees and things like that, but not necessarily PhDs. But in any case, the years of schooling definitely help. Okay. And so education is the kind of channel through which advantage is transmitted. But schools, meaning school quality, the difference between one school and another contributes almost nothing. Now, that's a bit of an extreme statement, but something on the order of 1% to 3% makes almost no difference. And the question is why. So here I'm going to draw a distinction between the way sociologists might think about this in explanatory terms and the way policymakers might think about it. And Jenks was thinking about it the way policymakers might think about it. So why would the differences between schools overall in American society not contribute a major amount to the differences in adult success? Well, one reason is because of all the things I was saying about cultural capital. It turns out that differences among students due to their family backgrounds actually contribute a lot more to schooling outcomes than things that happen in school. So when you were in school, some kids did well and some kids less well. And some of those differences, even a large part of those differences, weren't due to what the school did. They were due to differences students brought with them into the classroom. How much their parents made them do homework, what skills they had from childhood, how well they performed, you know, things that the school can't control. But the other point, and here's really, I'm going to just draw a very little crude picture here. So one thing is that family background matters a lot and influences school performance. So that's just one point. But the second point, and this is related to my point about the curve, schools aren't in the business, or aren't only in the business, of having everyone in the school do well or badly. They're in this business of ranking students, essentially. So no school, no elementary school, no high school gives all A's or all F's. They just don't do that. And in fact, there's a guy named, this is meant to reassure your parents and you, and remember this when you, there's a guy named Alexander Aston, who's really the big super scholar in this domain. And he's shown that for very privileged kids from high status educated family backgrounds who have a lot of skills, they have better chance of getting into really elite universities if they go to mediocre high schools. Because if they go to elite prep school type schools, the problem is the elite prep school has to find 2/3 of its kids who aren't its top performers. It cannot get every single student, so your parents struggle and fight if you're from one of these privileged LA backgrounds. What's the name of one of the best school, the best private school in LA? Anybody, or, huh? Something Wesley? Harvard Wesley. Okay, so your parents schemed from the time you were in kindergarten to get you into Harvard Wesley. And to get in, you have to have incredibly high test scores and be able to write and be able to do this and that and have activities and be athletic, and you're really a cool kid. And some proportion of kids who get in there will be defined as mediocre. Because in competition with all those other incredibly bright, motivated, high status kids who know everything, they're not going to be as good. So if you come out on top of one of those schools, you will be very well educated, very, very smart. You get to college, you be bored to death, and it sometimes happens flunk out, but neither here nor there. The real point is that those schools, they would love to get every single student in the class, mind you, into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, Williams, Berkeley, Stanford, you name it. But they actually can't do it. They can only advantage the top third of their class. They put huge resources into that top third, and they kind of let the bottom 2/3 fall by the wayside. I mean, they don't do nothing for all those years of tuition the parents have paid. So schools create within school variance. So if you think about it, there's variation in overall achievement between schools. I'm going to kind of put some weird measure of achievement, imagine here. So all the students in school A do worse than all the students in school B. But within school A, there's a huge amount of variation. And it turns out that within school variation is actually bigger than between school variation on average, okay? So if you imagine, again, this is, you imagine millions of dots like this that are the different, or thousands that are the different schools, right? And so the overall school varies. The average kid here scores higher on tests than the average kid here. But the amount of variation within the school is actually greater than the variation between the average of this school and the average of that school. So within school variation is actually larger on average, substantially larger than between school variation. But the other, so point one is family background matters a lot for achievement. Point two is schools actually are in the business of creating variation. And there actually is a lot of variation within schools. So, and again, on average, and I'm going to tell a very brief personal anecdote here, which is I think I had some learning disabilities, but anyway, they didn't diagnose those things in those days. And I was a horrible elementary school student. My parents saved all my report cards for reasons that remain utterly obscure, and when I cleaned out their house when they were in their 80s, I found this very carefully kept record. My father, had pasted everything in and written the names of every child on the back of every school picture. Okay, I mean, at some weird level, he definitely loved his kids. And I really did make C's all the way through elementary school, and I'll just tell you, little girls do not make C's. But I had frizzy hair, I lived in Tennessee, you weren't supposed to look like that, and you definitely were supposed to have good handwriting, which I never did, and many other problems. I didn't like school. And then in 7th grade, the principal of my unbelievably crummy public junior high came up to me and said, Ann, we've gotten back the IQ test scores, and you should be doing much better in school than you are. And he actually told me my score, which this was, again, in the days when people, and he said, only Tissy Smith got a higher score than you did. I thought, wow. And basically, I started making A's, and I made straight A's more or less, not consistently until I got to college. I made straight A's more or less through the rest of junior high and high school. Now, you could say, wow, school made a huge difference, or you had a favorite teacher who discovered you or something. But some other kid had a really bad experience on day one. The teacher took a big dislike to her and made her do worse than she would otherwise have done, right? So the school improved, it did. It had a big effect, improved my life chances. Now, it might have happened anyway. Maybe I was maturing out of some of my thing, or handwriting mattered less, and being able to understand what you read mattered more in junior high. I'm not sure. But, or just, anticipatory socialization. You get told you're smart, you think you are smart, something about that, and you perform better. So it's not that schools don't make a big difference, but they don't make the same difference for everyone, right? They make a negative difference for some people, a positive difference for others, and mixed. You have a good teacher one year and not a good teacher the next year. So that's a third kind of reason, which is related to the fact that schools create variation within them. But the policy research point goes even beyond this. It asks, in American schooling across the whole society, how different can schools be from each other, right? How much of the differences among adults across the whole society could be differences due to the quality of their schools, given that pretty much all American schools are the same in so many ways? They draw their teachers from the same pool. They pay them approximately the same mediocre wages. So yes, the ghetto school is, gets either the most dedicated teachers or the teachers who have to go work in the worst conditions. And the elite schools may get teachers who are more selected. But on average, the teachers are trained in the same kinds of teachers' colleges. They drawn from the same pool of students. The schools are organized in very much the same way. Classes of about 30 students, taught for about 6 hours a day, for in general 5 days a week, for in general a little less than 180 days a year, and with pretty much the same kinds of textbooks and curricula and so forth. So one of the ways of understanding why schooling doesn't contribute much to the variation in adult outcomes is not because schools don't matter. They matter a lot, but they are all doing pretty much the same thing, right? So how would you study that experimentally? How would you study the difference not between one school and another, but between school and no school? And we don't do experiments like keeping people out of school for 12 years. So human subjects would not like it. So what's a way of thinking about the difference between school and no school? Whether schooling is doing anything. Right there. This person, who actually was a co-author of this Jenks book, Inequality, her name Barbara Hines. She's professor at NYU, maybe just retired, did a very interesting book called Summer Learning. And she went to Atlanta, studied 5 schools, looked at rich kids and poor kids, and it turns out that in general, schooling makes a huge difference, especially for poor kids. And poor kids and rich kids progress at about the same rate during the school year, but during the summers, poor kids fall behind and middle class kids' skills keep growing. I'm just letting you really take that in. So if you didn't hear me, I'll repeat the point. You can put your hand up. In fact, the rap that American kids fail black children or fail poor children because they fall more behind every year, that's true. But they actually don't fall behind during the school year. They fall behind during the summer, which means that the American policy choice, and it is a policy choice, and so here I'm talking the same line that you're reading in Inequality by Design, to have a short school year and a short school day is hugely consequential. And when these local school districts are squeezed for money, as they are by the budgetary decisions we're making right now about whether to spend money on schools, who does it hurt? Not even, it may also be true that they fire the art teacher in the poor school district first, and they, squeeze the classrooms bigger in the poor school district, and lots of things like that probably are true. And the buildings aren't repaired, and the textbooks are, but that actually is not overall statistically what matters. It turns out that what matters is that we make the choice to have a short school day and a short school year, and not to put children in school from age 2, which the French do. And those are hugely consequential decisions. So I have another little graph here. Aha, the summer slide. And what this shows is that, so it's supposed to be in color and it isn't, but essentially these are low socioeconomic status kids, middle socioeconomic status kids, and high socioeconomic status kids. And these are reading comprehension test scores. And what you see is that in first grade, which is here, the poor kids and or not the poor kids, but the low performing kids and the higher performing kids, poor kids and rich kids, basically low status, high status, there are differences, but they're not all that great. And during the school year, kids progress at about the same rate, right? So schools actually, on average, do a pretty good job. While kids are in school, they actually learn quite a bit during the school year. But during the summers, poor kids fall behind, and so they start the next school year further behind. And then they actually, this is one of the fascinating things Barbara Hines showed, that schools actually, to some degree, lessen the variance, the variation, but so they pull the bottom up a little bit during the school year. That's actually, within classrooms, they do that. That's why, you know, parents of very, very bright, high-achieving kids are very frustrated. Because the public schools, if you send your kid to public school, you know, your kid is in a classroom with a bunch of kids who need to come up. And the school is devoting some attention, not maybe more attention than to your kids, but inevitably, they can't be teaching only to the top, and they don't. They teach the whole class. So you can just see that year after year after year, the poor kids are falling behind, not during the school year, but during the summers. And the rich kids, or the high status kids, seem to learn a lot during the summer. And then it also turns out that what poor kids do during the summer makes a big difference. So high status kids learn a lot during the summer whether they go to a camp or not. They learn a lot during the summer just by sitting at home. Maybe they read books, or their parents make them do workbooks, or they just absorb things from the family discussion, or they do little constructive projects, or they go to church and they read the Bible, who knows. But poor kids, it makes a huge difference whether they have structured summer programs. And if they go to camp, or they go to a summer school, or they go to something, they actually don't lose as much ground. So I'll make a policy point, which is the reason education does not contribute much, or let me put it this way, the reason the quality of schools does not contribute much to outcomes is basically that schools do not differ that much because of the basic institutional structure, and the policy choice that really matters isn't whether you torture teachers to get them to increase the test scores of their students. It's whether you have a longer school day and a longer school year. I studied alternative schools for my dissertation, and it turns out that the big predictor of outcomes wasn't whether it was a hippy-dippy free school or a traditional structured school. It made a big difference, actually, in how happy the kids were. The kids in the free schools were a lot happier. In the structured school, they were less happy. But the huge difference was what they call this very boring thing called time on task, which is how much time do you actually spend? And of course, the advantage of middle-class parents is that they can get their kids to spend more time on task at home, basically, both because they have the skills and the time and the emotional energy. And this is what you're reading about in Living the Drama, right? What is the relationship between the story he's telling in Living the Drama and the time a kid is going to actually spend focused on school, and the emotional energy a parent has to get her kid focused on school in these two neighborhoods, right? So this is the same story here. Okay, and let me see if I have time to make a last point. So schools don't very much social background matters, more summer learning. Let me just see if I can go to, all right. So the invisible policy choices are the short school day, short school year, and there is a move, but it's very, very expensive to create full-time, year-round schools. This does not mean 3 one-month vacations spread throughout the year. It actually means all-day school. And they did this in Nashville, Tennessee, to get out from under court-ordered busing that had gone on for 30 years and had driven most white families to the suburbs in Nashville, Tennessee. And the NAACP agreed to give up busing and school integration in order to get full-time year-round schooling in 6 virtually all-black schools in Nashville. And those kids' test scores came up to match the scores of kids in the white suburbs. So you want better schools, you pay for them, and what you pay for is more hours a day. So I would love it. My kids got their school homework done during school, and we could have had evenings just being a family and playing card games or something instead of me nagging and nagging and nagging. Oh my God, I would have given my right arm for that. And that is what a better system would be. Okay, I'll discuss a little bit of the rest of this next lecture.